what will the budget process mean for education funding? I'm Jill Horner. This is Comcast Newsmakers. With me this hour is Pennsylvania State Representative Stephen Bloom. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jill. It's great to be here.
Now, this is your first time as a freshman legislator going through the budget process. Talk to us a little bit about your priorities as you move through this process.
Well, the biggest thing for me, Jill, is that we did, in fact, do what I and the governor also promised on the campaign trail, which is to have a budget that doesn't increase spending, to actually reduce state spending and not raise taxes. That's the big picture, and that's very important, very critical, I believe, to the voters of Pennsylvania, that we have a government that takes responsibility for the fiscal situation we find ourselves in. And so instead of the past track record of the last 20 years or so, where government spending increased at a rate much higher than inflation every year, we're finally reining in government spending. So in the big picture, very pleased with the idea, and I think the voters have spoken loud and clear on this, that they want state government to rein in the spending, and that's what we're doing with the budget this year in Pennsylvania.
So that's big picture. Let's talk about some of the specifics. Let's focus on education cuts. Let's talk about basic ed, the subsidy going back to local school districts from the state level. What will we see there as this process continues? Because the governor's called for it to go back to 2008 levels.
Right. The government is talking about, the governor's talking about taking the education spending all the way back to pre-stimulus levels, before we had the money from the federal government under the stimulus program. That's okay, but it seems to me that it's a disproportionate share of the burden of the cuts that education is bearing. I believe as a legislature, we're going to be pushing back to some degree on the governor's budget to restore some of the funding to education and look at some other areas that the governor didn't touch in his proposal that really do need a close look. For example, the Department of Public Welfare. The Democratic Auditor General of this state did an extensive study of the Department of Public Welfare and found hundreds of millions in fraud and abuse taking place. We can't ignore that. We've got to go in there, and I think the legislature is well positioned to do that, because we've got folks who have been studying that problem for a long time. The governor's new. His team hasn't had a chance to really dig into DPW. We have. We're going to be looking at taking a real hard look at the DPW funding dollars, take some of that we can cut out, and perhaps restore some of that to the concept of the basic education funding, perhaps to the higher ed funding, because it seems to me that they're taking a disproportionate hit under the proposal. And obviously education's key, and we don't want any one area to bear more of a burden than other areas in bringing this government back to a responsible level of spending.
And you mentioned higher education. The governor has called for cuts there, about 52% of the state's portion going back to the state-related schools. What will that mean for higher education in Pennsylvania if that goes through?
Well, it's going to be a real challenge. And part of this environment is that we've all got to look long and hard at the way we are spending the money that the tax dollars are ultimately funding. So for one thing, it's going to mean our state-related institutions and our state-funded institutions taking some real hard looks at how they spend their money on staff, on equipment, and all those things that all of us have to tighten our belts right now, just like families do. But on the other hand, I think we've got to be careful that we don't undermine the future of Pennsylvania by cutting so severely that we lose the core functions of those educational institutions, and especially the institutions that are depending on state funding.
And we just have a short time left, but you're on Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee as one of your committees. What about agriculture cuts? What will we potentially experience there? What could that mean for one of the top industries in the state?
Ag is so important to Pennsylvania and obviously to our nation to have a safe, secure food supply. The current budget makes further deep cuts in agriculture. Agriculture has actually suffered a great deal under the past administration. For 8 years, their budgets were getting hacked every year. And so to be hurt again under this budget, it's going to be a problem. Again, I'd like to see some deeper cuts in the area of the public welfare funding, where we know there's fraud and abuse taking place, and have some of that restored to the vital services that support our ag industry in Pennsylvania, which is really what supports us as a state and as a nation, as our top industry.
Come back, give us an update. Let us know how the budget process is progressing.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.
We've been talking with Pennsylvania State Representative Stephen Bloom. I'm Jill Horner.